Hey, thank you for having me. It's really exciting to be here. And I'm going to talk about my project with Nicholas Coles. And what we want to do is fundamentally change how large-scale research works by focusing on the reliability and validity of the measures when we are interested in psychological phenomenon and we collect data in many languages all over the world. So I'm going to start by telling you about a challenge that isn't specific to psychology or the social sciences. It's anytime we have a scientific endeavor, we need to figure out how to measure what it is that we want to study. And when we work across cultures and in different languages, translation errors inevitably happen. So there are a lot of examples, famous ones, of measurement misunderstandings from science, but a relatively local one that you all might be familiar with is the tale of the Laufenberg Bridge. So this bridge connects Switzerland and Germany, and both countries were responsible for building part of the bridge. But they both defined sea level in a different way, so that when they were measuring the height of the bridge, they were starting from a different point, and they were actually building the bridge and realizing that it wasn't going to connect before they realized this problem. And I think that Germany had to foot the bill for that. So in psychology, we're not building bridges. We're building instruments to measure attitudes and how people feel. And we can have the same problem. We can define concepts differently, and then our results don't align. So I'm a psychometrician by training. I study the quantitative methods that we use to deal with this issue. And the technical term for this is called measurement non-equivalence. And it occurs when instruments do not function in the same way across groups or time. And the problem with it is that when things aren't equivalent, you can't validly combine data and you can't validly compare data. And I was actually just thinking right now, if I gave you guys a survey about your satisfaction with this talk in different languages, it would be really difficult to compare your results because we all think in different ways. So I've been working on measurement issues in big team science and replication research for the past few years. And as a part of that, I've reviewed all of the instruments in large-scale replication studies, the Reproducibility Project Psychology, and all of the mini-lab studies. These studies have attempted to replicate hundreds of psychological studies. And these are also global data collection efforts. But the problem is that translated instruments with strong validity and reliability evidence just don't exist in many languages. Many instruments are developed in one language, say English or German, and then the scientific feat of translating them and making sure those different translated versions produce valid and reliable scores isn't often undertaken. And it's particularly not undertaken on the shoestring budgets that we've been operating on in some of these studies. So I'll show you an example from just one instrument from the mini labs too. This graph, which is a little busy, shows a reliability coefficient of one instrument, Chromebox alpha. That's on the x-axis. This ranges from 0 to 1. And then all the data collection labs collect this instrument. Some of those are translated, and some of them aren't translated. And what we see, the dots up at the top, is that translated versions have lower reliability on average than the versions that were given in their original language. The problem for replication research is that when you decrease reliability, you decrease statistical power. So you're less likely to have a valid result of that study. But it also suggests that when participants read these instruments, that they thought about the concepts differently and that their responses weren't reliable. That's a measurement non-equivalence issue. And it undermines the validity of all of these large-scale studies, but it also undermines valid reuse. So our project wants to change that, the Translated Instruments Validation Initiative, or the TIVI. We want to change how large-scale research is done at the foundation. We want to develop a process for translating, evaluating, sharing, and then engaging with the community. The long-term goal is to make a database of instruments that can study psychological phenomena that we think are important across many disciplines, and that those instruments produce valid and reliable scores from different translated versions. But we're not there yet. Where we're going to start, we're not going to start by translating instruments. We're actually going to start by looking at instruments that have already been translated. So there's already an effort to globally measure psychological constructs. These are examples of instruments that have already been translated into dozens of languages. So we're going to start by looking at these instruments first. There's two reasons why looking at existing instruments makes sense. One is a scientific efficiency reason. There's already been massive effort put into translating these instruments. They've already been used in science, and the data are open and ready for reuse. So we can answer the scientific question of, do these instruments produce reliable and valid scores in different languages? But the second reason is that we can use this existing efforts in big team science and open science to perfect the process of translating and validating instruments. So how are we going to evaluate these instruments? We've actually been working on one pilot instrument for the past year. on a volunteer basis in collaboration with the Psychological Science Accelerator to figure out the process for evaluating these instruments. So I'm a quantitative psychologist, but the first step in the process isn't quantitative, it's qualitative. It's having people who are native speakers of the target language read the items and qualitatively assess if they were translated equivalently. And then we want to look at each instrument version and produce a psychometric validity report. So if for the German version, for the English version, for the French version. For instruments that have strong psychometric properties and strong validity evidence, we then want to conduct a formal psychometric measurement equivalence analysis to see if the instruments can produce valid and comparable scores. We can't assume that they do without checking that. If they do produce comparable scores, we can do large-scale comparison analyses. But importantly, each instrument will have a full validity report that reports on the results, whether they're positive or negative. So we know, because we've been doing this on a volunteer basis for the past few years, that you're not going to change how these research studies are done unless you make completely reproducible methodological pipelines so that other researchers can use the process. So from our pilot project, we've taken, these instruments are scattered around the internet, and so are the data with them, and there's no validity report to go along. So for the pilot instrument, we have started working on dynamic reproducible documents. So these are user-facing documents that can help to build the database. So this is from the Oxford Utilitarianism Scale. And this is just an example of what we've been working on, where a researcher could download the data in a specific language, see the analysis code, and see the output. This is an example of item histograms. But honestly, these psychometric analyses can be very complex. So we're not going to get anywhere if we don't teach people how to use them. So this is an example a little further down in this document where there's some didactic narrative explaining how the confirmatory factor analysis model was specified, which is a part of assessing the validity of the instrument, the data analysis code, and then the output. But we also know that there's a global interest in measuring psychological phenomena, not just from researchers, but from general lay public. For example, the Project Implicit website, which measures racial biases, has been accessed by thousands of people. So this is just a mock-up. We haven't actually done this yet. We're thinking about ways that people can access the instruments, get some basic information about where the data are collected, and learn a little bit more about a psychological construct around the world. So the final step is to engage and expand. So we're going to start with these instruments that have already been translated. And I'll be honest with you, I don't know if these instruments are going to produce valid and reliable scores. They're out there, but they haven't undergone any investigation. So we're going to collate that, we're going to curate that, and we're going to do the investigation. But what I hope that we're going to do is learn how to perfect this process, review how the instruments were translated, review the psychometric methodologies that are used to evaluate them, and figure out the best way to share these materials so that they can be reused. The long-term goal is to engage with the community to repeat this process. We've done a lot to run large-scale studies on single effects, but we haven't invited a team of global researchers to study a concept so that we could figure out how to translate that concept into different instruments and measure it in a standardized way that'll be reliable and valid across cultures and across the globe. So in closing, we think that there's massive potential to massive validation. It's been really exciting. I'm in my early career, right? And I've got to see science fundamentally change. This is a map of the Minilabs 2 project. They collected data from all over the world. They translated instruments into 16 different languages. The validity and reliability of those instruments has been an afterthought. But we think that we can use large-scale science to fundamentally reform measurement. Imagine that instead of replicating one study, we had this database of instruments that could be used in hundreds of studies by thousands of researchers in their targeted language. We can turn large-scale, big-team science into engines for valid and reliable small-scale, individual science. That's all I have. Thank you so much.